Okay, so far in these Devos, we've talked about a number of spiritual disciplines. We've talked about the spiritual discipline of study, fasting, silence, and what I called recreating, or the importance of recreation. A spiritual discipline is essentially a habit you regularly practice in order to grow closer to and more into the image of Christ. Today, I want to suggest that empathy, empathy, is an essential spiritual discipline to Christian living. Empathy means to try to see things from another person's perspective, essentially. And it's all over the Bible, even though it isn't named. Paul talks about it a lot in Romans 12:15. He says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep." How can you do that unless you don't first empathize? Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burdens. Philippians 2:4, he tells us to look to the interests of others. And most importantly, we see this in what Jesus says in one of the two most, and one of what he says is the two most important commandments in Scripture. We are to love our neighbor as ourselves. All of this requires sincere empathy in order to be truly attained. So I want to spend the next few moments making just a few points about the spiritual discipline of empathy, which I have certainly not even come close to mastering, but it is something that I've been trying to work on for a long time now. First of all, empathy requires the other person's perspective, not yours. Here's what I mean. There's a certain Christian artist that my papa doesn't care for. He just doesn't like his style. And we all know this, but one year for Christmas, my aunt, his daughter, got papa a CD from that particular artist, knowing full well he didn't like that particular artist. And when she went to explain it, this is what she said. I'll never forget. She said, "I know you don't like his music, but I love it. This is a great CD." Now, I understand what she was going for, but this is a great example of incomplete empathy. She was doing something for Papa that she would like for someone to do for herself, only if Papa was in her shoes. She needs to put herself in Papa's shoes in order for this to be true empathy. What does Papa like? What would she want if she were him, not if he were her? So make sure in your empathy you are not imposing yourself on the other person, but rather imposing the other person upon yourself. Secondly, empathy is the necessary doorway to true compassion and forgiveness. We are commanded over and over again in Scripture to show compassion and to forgive. Empathy leads to these things, is essential to these things. I've shared before about a time when my father received an angry note on the internet from a member in our church. I became aware of this and began harboring ill feelings towards this member of my dad's church. I eventually talked to my dad about it, let him know that I'd heard about it, and he told me, I'll never forget, he said, "Seth, before you get angry, you have to see it from the other person's perspective." He then told me what this particular member was going through, and in a matter of minutes, my dad led me from anger and judgment to compassion and forgiveness via empathy. Empathy doesn't necessarily make the wrong right. In other words, she still wasn't necessarily right, but what it did was it helped me understand where she was coming from, and suddenly I felt compassion for her and forgave her without even having to try. Thirdly, empathy is literally what Jesus did for us. A simple definition of empathy, and what the original meaning of the word literally means, is to get into the skin of another person. What did Jesus do when he took on flesh? He literally empathized with us. And therefore, Hebrews 4:15 tells us we do not serve a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, and yet is without sin. This truth ought to be a comfort to you, because Jesus knows what it's like to be tempted, to be betrayed, to be forsaken. He knows what it's like. And this ought to also be an inspiration that motivates you to empathize, to be like Jesus in your interaction with others. Empathy is not easy. We like to see things from our own perspective, so it's difficult to be selfless, even more to be selfless enough to truly let go of our agendas and try to understand someone else's. But listen, there is freedom in the Christian discipline of empathy. We'll see.